Okay. How you doing? Welcome to the Otherppl Show. My name's Brad Listi here in Los Angeles, California. It's nice to be talking to you. I have on the program today Forrest Gander. He has a new poetry collection out on New Directions. It is called Twice Alive. Forrest Gander won the 2019 Pulitzer Prize for Poetry for his collection Be With. He was also a finalist for the Pulitzer and the National Book Critics Circle Award for his collection entitled Core Samples from the World. He's one of our most accomplished poets, and through the years he has collaborated with artists in a variety of different media, including Sally Mann, the photographer, Raymond Meeks, and the late Vic Chestnut. So a wonderful time talking with Forrest Gander, meeting him, and getting to learn a little bit more about him, his work, and his life. And I thought that we would begin today, as I often do with poets on this show, by hearing from Forrest himself, hearing him read a selection from his new collection. So here he is. This is Forrest Gander reading a poem entitled Immigrant Sea from his new collection, Twice Alive.
Aroused by her inaccessibility, he aches for more of her life to live inside him. Watching the breakers, standing so close he can feel heat coming off her wet scalp. What is his relation to this person before him? So familiar and foreign. The way he searches out her face, he searches out himself. Gusts thrash crests of swell. Spring grasses twirl circles in the sand where they stand without speaking. She wants him to know it's all charged. Even grass, positive, pollen, negative. So when grass waves, it sweeps the air for pollen. He feels electricity all around, as though the wild drama of the coming storm were already aware of them, foreigners on this shore. Little sapphire blue flowers speckle the dunes. He wonders if he has let himself flatten out into a depthless sheet like escalator stairs, whether in the end he'll disappear underground without the smallest lurch of resistance. But when her lavish face turns toward him, beaming, the corners of her eyes wind wet, he yields to that excess. He reappears to himself.
Okay, there you go. That's Forrest Gander reading a poem entitled Immigrant Sea from his new collection, Twice Alive, available now from New Directions. Today's episode of the Otherppl podcast is brought to you by Restless Books, publisher of the debut novel Catch the Rabbit by Lana Bastasic. Catch the Rabbit won the 2020 European Union Prize for Literature. It's now available in translation over here in the States from Restless Books. This is a fine novel. I just had Lana on the program last week, had a great talk with her. I love this book. It's a road novel. It's a story about identity and memory and friendship, and in particular, friendship between women, and how the people in our lives, especially those whom we're closest to, the bonds we forge in our childhood in particular, how those bonds and those people help us to understand who we are and where we are and what happened. Catch the Rabbit by Lana Bastasic, available now from Restless Books. All right, so let's get to today's conversation. My guest, once again, is Forrest Gander, Pulitzer Prize-winning poet and author of the new collection, Twice Alive, available now from New Directions. Here he is, folks. This is Forrest Gander.
there's so much anguish about our situation, our ecological situation. I wanted to approach the book also celebrating the beauty and the modalities like intimacy with lichen that we can feel hopeful about. So it's not just the bad trip of the bad news.
So talk to me about lichen, because this was something that in reading, the author's note at the top and then reading the collection itself, I was struck by, I think you mentioned how we learn about this in high school. I was struck by the fact that I must have been absent that day or forgotten it altogether, which would be totally on brand for me. But can you talk a little bit about lichen and how it inspired the, kind of the thematic concerns of the collection?
Sure. Yeah. I had an opportunity to work with this fantastic mycologist named Anne Pringle, who often writes for the New York Times about fungi and mushrooms, lichen. Up in Michigan, near Lake Huron at this wilderness area. And it turns out that, as with so many things, we think we're so advanced, but scientists have realized they don't really even know what lichen is. On that day that you missed in high school, when I was there, they taught us that, it's basically two things, an algae and a fungi that get together, or cyanobacteria could be part of the algae, that they get together and they make this other thing that acts different from algae and different from a fungus, and that's permanent. They're invested in this collaborative entity that they make forever. And the forever part is interesting too, because the scientists are realizing, and Pringle being one of them, that perhaps lichen has a kind of theoretical immortality. If it's given enough nutrients, it might not die. So the thought of two things that come together and make something stronger, something different in their collaboration, in that mutuality, and that might not die, made me think very much about human intimacy, about our deepest relations, our most intimate relations that transform us, that expand who we are. And I thought of using that as a way of thinking about our intimacy with the world and with each other.
Yeah, and for those listeners at home who are trying to picture lichen in their minds and might be failing at that, can you describe where one might see it?
We've all seen it. It's that stuff that can be with stuff all over rocks. In every landscape that there is lichen, including in the Arctic and in the deserts. It's an indicator for. So we see it on rocks. It's often gray or slightly green. It can look very dry. It's almost impossible to tell if lichen is dead or alive. People refer to it both as lichen singular and lichen plural, but it's the same stuff. And it's an indicator for pollution too. We see more of it on rocks and trees in climates that have good air.
Interesting. Okay, so Mike, you said that you mentioned that you worked with Anne Pringle, who's a mycologist, and mycologists, if I'm not mistaken, are concerned with fungi, with mushrooms, right?
Right, but so lichens is at least half of it is a fungi. And then the other half is this cyanobacteria or an algae. And actually then it gets more complicated. There are more creatures involved in it as well. And that's part of also what I'm trying to write about in this book, is how even our notions of ourselves are romanticized when we think that we're one thing, because we're composed of of thousands of bacteria that have different DNA that are part of our DNA, that we have parasites moving through our system that we depend upon to help break down our food that are part of us, and parasites whose DNA has become part of our DNA. So that old racist thing, the Ku Klux Klan, but not only is there not racial purity, but there's no such thing as species purity. We are just mongrels.
Well, it's funny. It's interesting to hear you say that, because I was having a conversation on this show not too long ago about identity and the self. And I read a lot about this. This is fascinating to me, this idea that whatever we perceive of as our fixed selves is actually an illusory notion. And yet to talk about it and to try to explain it is something that I'm gifted at botching. Once I get into like the weeds on it, but in truth, and I think nature is a great place to look and reflect on this, it's not that difficult to understand that we are composites and that we're deeply interrelated, not just human to human, but human to animal and human to plant. Like, I don't know why human beings do such a consistently poor job of acknowledging this deep truth and behaving accordingly.
Yeah, me too, Brad. I mean, I think partly, Christianity, for all the good things that it may have brought to the world, divided life up into the redeemable and the irredeemable, and also gave humans the roles of being above all of the animals and the rest of the world, the masters. And that kind of thinking has collided with our understanding of science now and of the self, and we've seen where that kind of thinking has led the world to a complete obsessive way of just using the world for our own needs and for our own short-term needs, and that's having results that are going to start killing us as well as all the other species.
Yeah, I was having a conversation. I mean, this is kind of related, but at an angle. And I was talking to my friend about the NBA playoffs, and we were lamenting that our team was not faring well. And the superstar on the team is an incredibly likable human being. I don't know if you follow basketball, but Giannis Antetokounmpo.
Yeah.
He's just like the most likable, nicest guy. And I was saying, I was sort of like, he's got to get meaner if they're going to win. And I was kind of grief-stricken as I said this, because I feel like this is what our society does. Like Michael Jordan, who's like, we valorize this kind of like vicious, hyper-individualistic, competitive, win at all costs mentality. And I think I was sort of like grief-stricken because I was like, oh my God, is this what's going to have to become of this nice young guy who's like smiling all the time if he's ever going to, win? And then I think about that, like countenanced against, the way that human beings relate to one another and relate to our environment. And, I know it's kind of, it's kind of far afield, but I feel like it's all of a piece in a way. The way that our wrong-headed thinking has led us to this spot where we've managed to put our very, our very existence as a species and the very existence of the planet in peril.
Yeah, it's an amazing moment. And a single star player, even Steph Curry, can't make it to the finals without a whole team around him. Yeah.
There you go. And I think too, there's something radical. And earlier I said, wow, it's really not that hard to grasp that we all need one another and that we're all interrelated. At the same time, there is something I think radical about this notion of being a composite, of not being the fixed self that we look at in the mirror and conceive of maybe in our minds. when that starts to come apart, that's not a small change in the way that we reckon with ourselves. It's a big shift.
Radical. Yeah. It's a radical change, but it doesn't have to be a horrifying one. It's sort of a change where we realize that we've already merged with the world. Just as when we're born, it's the world and human language that constructs our minds. We don't do it on our own. It's these systems in place that we're integrated with, that make us who we say we are. But it could be a joyous thing, finding how much we share with trees, with other animals, and then to take some responsibility for that. What does that mean? How can we just say that human life is so much more important than the life of billions of other creatures?
Well, and the ways in which, too, I think we underestimate the intelligence of nature. If we're on the subject of mycology, I think, I've listened. I want to say you acknowledge Paul Stamets in your book, in the back matter of your book, and I've listened to some interviews with Paul Stamets through the years, and am familiar with the work that he does. I'm no expert on it, but it can be pretty thrilling to hear about the intelligence of fungi, and like that whole world is almost alien. And I don't think most people have the opportunity to spend the time to maybe think deeply about all that, or understand like what's at work just in that area of nature alone. But it's pretty magnificent.
Yeah, I think, and that sort of paying attention to the world around us is a lot like reading poetry, that, we're surrounded by spectacle and constant incoming, and to make sure that we retain control over what we give our attention to, so that we can have these experiences like all alone, reading a book in a room, that are transformative, or that we notice when we go outside that it's not just a bunch of birds, it's a flock of, Carolina parakeets or something, that we see. Those sorts of discriminations, I think, give both perception and feeling a kind of nuance that can expand the meaning of what it is to be human.
Yeah, and something that your collection made me think about too is this notion of being able to name things. You have such a wonderful grasp of your surroundings, at least insofar as this collection is concerned, in ways that I often don't. And I lament this, like going out into nature and not knowing what the name of a certain tree is, even though I might admire it, knowing what the name of a certain flower is. I think there's real value in getting good at that. I wish I were better at it, because I think once you have that sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? Is it taxonomy? You know what I mean? Like being able to name and categorize things, and having at least that level of intimacy with your surroundings deepens your appreciation a bit. And if it, like at the very least, just gives you I don't know. It's like knowing somebody's name. It personalizes it a bit. There's a level of respect that I think it offers.
Well, I thought that I had a pretty sharp awareness of things outside of me. I grew up in Virginia a lot, and spent a lot of time since I didn't have a father, and my mother was working all the time. I was on my own in the woods. But when I was hanging around with Anne Pringle, this mycologist in Michigan, I was just shocked by how many mushrooms are around us all the time that I never noticed. And that, again, sort of noticing how much we're surrounded by and involved with other life I think can be a really stimulating opportunity for us to think of ourselves as being connected and not so singular.
Well, and being in that mode, obviously, like that fits well into the life and concerns of a poet. I think it cuts pretty strongly against current cultural values. The kind of hyper digital attention economy that we find ourselves in, all the distractions, all the spectacle that you referenced earlier, and trying to be a person who pays attention and who recognizes interconnectivity, and recognizes and honors nature, is not something that we necessarily hear a lot of applause for in mainstream culture. And I guess I'm curious to hear you talk about how you structure your life. Like, are there things that you do to try to block out time? Are there things that are there certain austerities that you take on in your daily life to try to make sure that you don't get lost in the noise?
It's funny that you asked me this, Brad, because it's sort of the same question I have for you, because I'm kind of amazed that you keep up with so much reading, and that also your responses, your job is perfectly made for you, because you have a mind that's very relaxed and can be very referential along a lot of planes. It's kind of impressive.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like, if I'm being honest, keeping up with the reading, I feel like I'm swimming in books, which is a great thing. I think during the pandemic especially, I've had more time to read, just for a variety of life circumstances. But one of them is just that I'm home all the time. I've been home, not as much movement, just trucking the kids back and forth to school and things like that. But I worry sometimes that I'm reading too quickly. I'll say that, as a confession. But I don't know. I think I know what I don't know, and I'm very curious. And so it's a joy to get to talk with people who spend a lot of time inside their own minds and reading and making books. To me, it's just like an education, like a continuing education.
Yeah, that's my company too. I like Nietzsche described himself as a teacher of slow reading.
Yeah.
And anybody who reads poetry is, I think that's the fear some people have about poetry, is that it takes a slow reading. It takes a kind of investment and involvement, and not just a kind of passive looking at images blow up on a screen.
Well, okay, and this is a question I have as a reader of poetry, is trying to find equilibrium between intentional, slow reading, careful consideration of the text, and getting bogged down or insecure in places where I feel like I'm missing references or not quite understanding the full intent of the author. I think there has to be some balance between a slow, careful read and also just like kind of letting it wash over you. Sometimes you just have to let yourself go along for the ride, right?
Totally, Brad. I think that's really important. I think that it's not so vital that you understand logically everything that happens in an artwork or in a poem, that you do let things wash over you, because because its importance isn't as just a message. Essays are good for that and can be really logical, but a poem is using a system of thinking and feeling that has leaps in it, and I think, like, sometimes in my work I use scientific language that I know not everyone is going to understand, or sometimes I use Spanish because I'm interested in bilingual texts. And even if someone doesn't understand those, they have a texture, a sound quality, a texture, and also the context also often lets you sort of know what it means. But I think And, Keats most famously talks about negative capability, says to his brother, you don't want to be scrambling after every little meaning as you go along. You want to be hit by the whole thing. You want it to, hit you between your brain and your genitalia where your heart is.
And you do some interesting things formally, like with the text that I haven't seen or haven't seen much of. One of them is the use of, I guess you would call it bullet points, but it's not bullet points in the traditional usage. It's not a vertical stack of bullet points, but it's bullet points in between words in the text, words in a particular stanza. The other thing is the use of boldface. I'm sure there are other instances or examples of this that I simply have not seen, but it was striking to me, and I'd just be curious to hear you talk a little bit about those creative choices.
So the sort of dots that I'm using are as a way of, instead of I'm really interested in line break and poetic line break and the way that can remake meanings. But in those poems, which are often based on these Sangam poems, which is this Indian tradition, I wanted the connections to be a little quicker so that there wasn't a line break that you came and jumped all the way back to the beginning. But I also wanted to break up the rhythmic havoc of iambic pentameter so that it didn't feel, so that there was a stumble in sort of perception. The way we use iambic pentameter, it's like the perfect break in casual conversation. We have little pauses about after every 5 syllables. But to break that up and make the reading experience a little more complicated, a little more hobbled, so that it's breaking up before the rhythm finishes, and there's this little connection, but not a complete syntactical connection to the next line. That interested me. The boldface, I use boldface words Brad's talking about in the longest series in the book, which is this Lichen series, the title sequence called Twice Alive. And curiously, it's been the thing that I've heard most from others who have written me saying, really like the book, but what's this with the boldface words here? I totally don't get it. And so I'm wondering about how that worked, but this is the poem about lichen. And so I'm thinking about having a sort of different characteristic, like, you have the fungus and the cyanobacteria. This is like the dark cyanobacteria. You have this different quality embedded in the text as a kind of enactment of a cooperative system.
And then, just to kind of finish the conversation we've been sort of having throughout about the work that you did, kind of out in nature, observationally. I'm curious to know how you got in touch with Anne Pringle. Like, how did you get to this point where this became a concern of yours and you were working in collaboration with a mycologist? Yeah.
Well, for one thing, I have a degree in geology, and I've maintained friendships with lots of people in the fields of science and physics and biology. I also travel with a wonderful biologist poet here in Sonoma, in Maya Khosla. But with Anne Pringle, I was invited because I write about, for lack of a better word, what we call nature a lot, the non-human a lot. I was invited by a wonderful literary scholar named Lynn Keller to come up and be part of a group there was a Native American artist and a photographer and a poet and a scientist and this literary critic, Lynn Keller. And we all went up to see what we could learn from each other in this incredible environment, on the pristine environment on Lake Huron.
Oh, that's actually a nice thing to hear, and something that I think should probably happen more often. And it's bringing to mind something I was thinking I want to say just yesterday, and already I'm forgetting the context, but it had to do with cross-pollination. You know what it was? It was it had to do with like neuroscience and quantum physics and meditation concerns and the way that these things are in dialogue with one another. But I'm sure you're probably familiar with ways in which like people from the scientific community have met with people in spiritual communities, and they've had a dialogue where they've realized that they have arrived at some similar places, even though they've taken different routes. And
yeah,
I think that it makes a lot of sense to me, and I think it yields interesting results. Obviously, when you take somebody from the arts like yourself and you put them in dialogue with people from the sciences and different disciplines and people who are also focused on the natural world but coming at it from a different angle. It seems like a wise course of action and something I wish would happen more often.
Well, it used to be that, science was considered to be absolutely rational, and it sort of takes place on either end of an equal sign, and poetry is something completely different that has to do with sort of uncertainties. But, late 20th century and certainly 21st century, uncertainty is a quality of most of the sciences, not just physics, particle physics, and that's brought literature, philosophy, and science closer together, I think. I always brought my poetry classes, to see the particle physics lab of Humphrey Maris at Brown University.
And what would you look at there?
We would look at uncertainty. He would be trying to split an electron, which is thought to be impossible, and then figure out if you did split it and you looked for half of it, what happened to the other half. And he was trying to film this also. But that's very much about giving up control, giving up the sense that the humans control everything, and that something can only be in one place also, or that something is going to be where you look for it. In fact, it's probably going to be where you don't look for it. And that has a lot to do, I think, with art and poetry. That is what distinguishes it from political writing or essays, is that poetry has been in every culture that's ever been studied, something that we could call poetry, that's often connected with shamanism, with magic, with spirituality. And those kinds of movements don't depend so much on logocentrism, which Western culture has become so addicted to.
I think that's why I always love talking to poets. I notice it, that I have a lot of, like, I'm not a poet myself, but I feel simpatico, in the sense of those concerns, because I feel like the spiritual, for lack of a better word, concerns that I often find in poetry are mirrored in my own day-to-day. I don't see how to do life without entertaining those things. And I guess I find in poetry and in conversations with poets, just a comfort level, because, it's a very unique tribe of people who are doing that work in a culture that doesn't often give a shit or is tuned into entirely different entertainments. Let's put it that way,
Yeah. No, the New York Times is so frustrating that it won't review poetry. But the cool thing is, Brad, that at this moment in time in the United States, there's just the Academy of American Poets was just touting this big survey, and poetry reading in the United States has just logarithmically increased in the last 10 years. Partly because of all this focus on politics and identity, and people are finding that that the spectacle isn't feeding some part of their soul that needs to be fed, and that the greatest increase in reading poetry in the United States right now over the last 7 years has been among young people and people of color. So I think from the grassroots level, there's a fire lit, and that poetry is increasingly a part of mainstream culture.
That's nice to hear, and it makes sense that there would be a hunger for it. You'd have to believe there would be, because there's just parts of being a human being that are not nourished by, other cultural offerings. Like it fills a void. It fills a need. And I've made the argument to poet friends of mine over the last decade or so that poetry in this environment is actually at an advantage. I think it's uniquely well suited, or comparatively well suited to the internet in ways that longer form pieces are not. Like, I have a hard time reading a 10,000 word essay on a computer screen, but I can read a poem and enjoy a poem online pretty much just the same as an actual book. Though I always prefer the paper, but I can do it more easily is the point. And I just am curious to know, like, what your take on that is as a poet. Like, do you embrace the digital? Have you found opportunities in it that didn't exist, 10, 20 years ago that have helped you reach readers?
There's an interesting case of a Japanese poet whose parents were in the town, not Shigaraki, where the nuclear
Fukushima.
Fukushima, thank you. Yeah, Fukushima. And his parents refused to leave, and so he stayed there and was one of the few people sort of giving reports from there. And his reports, his daily reports, were in the form of Twitter poems that became really important for a really large audience of people wanting to know what was happening there. And I think that's an example of poetry adapting to new media in a way that that was significant. I think, like Malcolm X says, it's by any means necessary. And although don't participate in social media myself, just because I can't figure out how to have time for it all, I think emojis and Twitter language, and I think all of that can feed an interesting and transforming poetics.
And then what about, because this is an interesting segue, because I feel like we're jumping from one end of the spectrum to the next, though correct me if I'm wrong. But you talk about Twice Alive as working in a tradition called Sangam literature. And that, I want to say, was a 600-year period, like 300 BC to 300 AD, essentially.
Yeah.
And it originates in India. But can you talk a bit more about, like, how you came to want to write in this tradition? Like, what was your introduction to it, and how did you get to the place where you found yourself kind of carrying that torch?
Well, I'm looking for, like you, look what you do. Both of us are sort of looking for what's happening in my art here in the U.S., everywhere. And how are people responding to this crisis, the environmental crisis that we have, and what precedents were there for it? So, of course, I'm interested in Chinese poetry and Japanese poetry, which for a long time, revered nature, but often kind of symbolically. There aren't very particular names attached to the references to nature in classical Chinese poetry or Japanese poetry. So looking for other models, and I have been traveling, spending a lot of time in India. I live within a woman who grew up in India and has only lived in the States for the last 5 years, and India's really fascinating. Linguistically, it's fascinating. You're never in a conversation in which at least three languages are being used. You know, a local language, you know, like Tamil or Kannada. Then there'll be some Hindi words. There'll be some English words. That kind of mix, again, that sort of a collaborative language really fascinates me. But then I found out about this tradition, because India also has largely symbolic, but ancient belief system of the relationship between the non-human world and the human world. So many of their gods are part animal and part God, and animals are very involved in people's lives. So I found out about these translations by A.K. Ramunujan of this system of poetry. Right. So 2,000 years ago, what people were writing for several hundred years in southern India were poems in which you could not express subjectivity, your emotional subjectivity, without referencing the landscape around you, the major landscapes, the 5 major landscapes of southern India. And that's very connected to what a lot of people who call themselves eco-poets here are doing, which is different from nature poetry, not just going out and identifying something out in nature and coming back and writing a poem about it, but from the beginning, trying to write a poem in which you're already part of nature, where language and perception is a relationship. It's not something just generated by the powerful human.
And you spent time, how much time have you spent in India?
I spent a lot of time in India in the last number of years, traveling around, and I've been writing about it quite a bit. Have you, Brad?
No, it's on my list. I'd love to go, but I have not been yet.
So just fascinating place, and also because it's so everything is palimpsestic. You know, the architecture. You know, there's Muslim stuff and Hindu stuff and Buddhist stuff, and they're all built on top of each other. And the languages are like that too. So many languages, and and this relationship between the natural world it's all natural world, right? We're natural world, but the non-human world and the human world is very deep in Indian culture.
What part of the country have you? I mean, is it all over, or is there a specific region that you spend a lot of time in?
It's all over, but I've mostly spent time in the south, and Sangam poetry is a southern India phenomenon.
Yeah, because the Tamil, isn't that a Sri Lankan reference? I'm could be totally botching it, but that's what it evoked for me, because I'm thinking of the Tamil Tigers.
That's right, the Tamil Tigers. That's the same Tamilians who sailed to Sri Lanka. Yeah.
Have you been to Sri Lanka?
I haven't been to Sri Lanka except in Michael Andage's books.
Okay, yeah, I want to go there too.
Yeah, me
seems
too.
A fantastic place. So I want to talk to you about your biography a bit more. You mentioned briefly in the early going about growing up in Virginia. First of all, what part of Virginia?
So both we lived not far from Washington, D.C., but in the summers, because my mother was exhausted raising 3 children on her own, she got rid of us. And every summer I spent time in Southern Virginia, in Rockbridge Baths, near Lexington, which has led to a friendship with Sally Mann, who lives in Lexington. She went to the same camp that I went to as a kid down there. When it was first, it was gender separated, so I would be there first, and then she came there as soon as the boys left.
No kidding. So you're buddies with Sally Mann?
So Sally Mann and I, we did. I have a book where she's done a couple covers for my books, and I have a book of collaborative poems for her photographs, and we stay in touch.
Okay, because you talked about being out in the woods. Southern Virginia is a good place for that. Like growing up, a lot of contact with nature there.
Yeah, yeah. I had pet leeches and muskrats and all kinds of snakes. My mom was very forgiving.
Yeah, she has to be a forgiving and patient, raising three kids on her own.
Yeah.
So what about like formation as a literary human, as a poet? Like, is this something that you came to in that youth, like out in nature, or was it something that coalesced later for you?
Well, the first poems I wrote were so-called nature poems, but my mom loved poetry, and she loved poetry because her father, who was a Swede, loved poetry, and he would. It was that time when everyone memorized poetry. He could stomp around the house reciting these old 19th century poems. You call me chief, and you do well to call him chief, who for 12 long years fought and faced every form of man or beast the Roman Empire could provide. You can go on and on. And my mom brought me up reading Edgar Allan Poe and Carl Sandburg and sort of popular English language poets. So that got into me early on. And I thought I was a hotshot poet in high school. And my first year in college, William and Mary at a little house on next to Wren Chapel. I met my English professor and showed him my poems, and he read a few, and he looked up to me with these doleful eyes like a basset hound and said, "Forrest, these are terrible." And that was the real beginning of my education as a poet, because then I thought, oh, this isn't just about my ego and I need to learn something about the art. And then I began reading very intensively.
Isn't it it's nice, in retrospect at least, that you have somebody who cares enough about you when you're that age to tell you that the poetry is terrible. Sometimes teachers miss on that. They're trying to be too nice.
Yeah, it's true. It was important for me.
So you're a young man, you're at William and Mary, you've got like a sheath of poems, that you've already put down. Were you thinking like, this is going to be my life? Because that's like, I think from the outside looking in, especially, people are like, how does one wind up a poet? Like that's your trade.
Yeah.
Was it something that you conceived of and kind of declared, or was it something that like one day, several years later, you looked up and realized that you were?
I had the bug really deep, and then, which meant like probably for you too, Brad, that your closest friends were also writers, and you were talking about this stuff all the time. You just breathed it. So it's what I wanted to do, but I was the only male in my family. I had a mom and two sisters and a grandmother, and I had a sense that I needed to be a responsible, boy. And so I love geology too. So I majored in both. Geology, I figured I would get a job in. But I got cancer. The year after I graduated from college, I'd been actually interviewing at geology jobs, and I had third stage melanoma. So it was a really close call. And while I was in the hospital, I had time to really think about, what if my life is not going to be as long as I had planned? What do I really most want to do? And that's when I launched myself into an MFA program in San Francisco.
Wow. So that's a young age. You're young to get melanoma. I feel like that's something that you build up towards, or something, with like lots of years of sun exposure.
Well, it was a time before people talked about sun exposure much. And my summers, I was a lifeguard on the beach near Ocean City, Maryland. And I have light skin. So I did everything wrong.
Okay, yeah, I have like pre-skin cancers on my arms because I lived in Colorado as a young person and was hiking outside at
Yeah.
altitude, and I've gotten better. I found out when I was in my early 30s, and I've basically been like a vampire or just very careful since then. But I just went to the dermatologist this week to get my checkup, so I'm okay for now. But
Good for you, Brad. Good.
Yeah. You got to be careful. So this is our PSA for people listening. Like, wear sunscreen, wear a hat, don't think you're invincible. But, it's easy to kind of think of in terms of fate when you have the benefit of hindsight. But just as you're going out to potentially pursue a different course, the more practical, you've got that geology degree. It's I don't know if it's the most linear path, but it's certainly a more linear path than poetry.
Yeah.
You wind up in a situation where you're faced with your own mortality in your 20s. It was in your 20s, correct?
Yeah, my early 20s.
Yeah. So, I mean, that to me, it's easy to make heads and tails of that by saying like, well, this is the gods telling you that you're a poet.
Right.
Yeah.
Cool, die, so write something. Yeah.
Is the sense of urgency and clarity and courage, if that's what you want to call it, that you derived from those experiences in the hospital, kind of staring down death, is that something that made a lasting and permanent change on your perspective, or was it fleeting? I say this because I've been curious before, and I've tried to even conjure this in myself in the absence of an actual experience like that, where, it's like that thought exercise that you do. Like, what would I do if I had 6 months to live?
Yeah.
Like, how would I actually behave personally and professionally? And it's nice to imagine that you would make some sort of radical, fundamental, permanent shift in your orientation to the world. But I wonder that in remission and with the cancer in the rearview mirror, if there's a loss of perspective and maybe a reversion to like old habits of mind. Do you see what I'm saying?
Of course I do. Yeah. And that's usually the way that things work, that you have a little revelatory moment and you think it's going to change your life, and then you screw yourself back into that dull wood that you were in before.
Right.
But I think it's part of my personality. I always identified with Kent in King Lear. When Kent is disguised and trying to get hired by Lear so he can actually take care of him. Lear asked him, "What can you do?" And Kent says, "I can run, ride, mar a curious tale in telling it, and deliver a plain message bluntly. What ordinary men are fit for, I am qualified in, and the best of me is diligence." And I think that I wasn't as brilliant as some of my friends were, but I had a diligence that was partly manifest by that experience. I was visited by a premature seriousness in my early 20s when I'd been screwing around, and then the scars are considerable, and they're a reminder. You don't not see those looking in the mirror when coming out of the shower. And I've had other, it's come back also. Once it's in you, it's in you. So it did, I think, change me more long term. I wish other experiences where I had revelations had the sort of durance that diligence that came from that experience had.
Yeah, I feel that way about psychedelic experiences.
Yeah.
Where you're like, wow, you have these flashes and they're so profound in the moment and then fleeting after the fact, or hard to sort of language or hold on to. They're slippery. But the cancer scare and the fact that you say that it's still sort of there and it's kind of a shadow, following you everywhere in the aftermath, you're never permanently extracted from it. So I could see how the changes that it affects could be lasting.
Yeah.
But congrats on, all these years later, you've made
Thank
it.
you. Glad to be vertical and talking with you, Brad.
Absolutely. So let's talk about the aftermath. In your 20s, you get to a place where you're not in the hospital anymore, and you've made some decisions about your life and how you would like to proceed. Like what happened?
So then, instead of going to graduate school in geology, I applied to graduate school in creative writing. And instead of staying on the East Coast, where I had been living for the last 20 years, I went to the West Coast, which is where I had been born. And I just wanted to get out of everything that I knew into something that I didn't know and could explore and feel excited about.
I think going west is the place to exercise that impulse. I certainly had that same impulse, this desire to kind of like just be in a landscape that was totally unfamiliar to me, and to move into like wide open spaces, and also to be in contact with like nature in some of its grandest forms.
I know, California, it's just, yeah.
It's great, right?
It's just amazing. I love waking up here. I love these hills. I love the trees.
Yep.
And I worry about, the drought.
I do too. I mean, I was just reading about Salt Lake City, or I was reading in the Salt Lake City Tribune. I want to say the entire state of Utah has had to ban fireworks. It's not just California, but the whole American West is just dry as a bone, yeah. And I don't see, like, I mean, this is a well-documented, but something that's on my mind all the time is the fire danger and the ways in which fire season in the state of California and in Oregon and, other states in the American West is just now like a normal feature. And 15 years ago, even, this wasn't something that I don't recall being like super concerned about it on an annual basis, but now it's like every year you got to weather these incredible fires and hope that, it doesn't hit you or hit those.
Yeah. So, and as you know, I've got some poems in the book about the very next town to mine, Santa Rosa, which burned, and Petaluma became a sort of refugee camp for the people from Santa Rosa. But also, and that, sort of, there's a question like this environmental crisis is like really a real thing. It's a serious thing. It's the crisis of our time. What does poetry have to do with it? Like if there's not that many people reading poetry, what's the point of writing about this stuff in poetry? But I think that it takes everything, that the scientific language for describing our situation has been employed for at least 20 years, longer really. And it hasn't been so effective, that it's going to take poets and artists and novelists and for that exigency to be felt by a large population. And I think poets have a role in that too.
Sure, of course. And like mapping too, I think like it's not just the outer world, which I guess with increasing frequency people can finally see. I think one of the challenges with the climate change crisis is the fact that so many of the worst effects of it were a ways off and weren't in people's backyards necessarily. Like either a ways off temporally or a ways off geographically. Like maybe Alaska was warmer than ever and glaciers were melting, but down in Iowa you didn't necessarily feel it. But now I feel like people are feeling it. And when I think of art, the role of art and literature in helping us map this, I think not only of nature itself and the careful observation of it, but I also think of the interior experiences of it. It's a serious stressor, like fire danger in California. When those fires are happening, pretty much every late summer, early fall now, and the sky is filled with smoke, and the sun is like a blood orange, and you can stare at it, and just kind of see it hanging up there through the murk. It's deeply sad. We need art to help us find language for that experience and to help us deal with the emotional parts of it.
Yeah, I agree. It's just apocalyptical. Yeah, and we need language to guide us through it.
So when you went to San Francisco State to get your master's degree and to really kind of dig in and take poetry seriously, is that where you wrote your earliest poems that were collected?
Um, so I had gone to William and Mary and double majored in geology and English. I was kind of overtrained for my master's course in at San Francisco State. So I was just there for a year and a half. But it was the early 80s, and San Francisco was a fantastic petri dish for poetry then. The language poets were making a lot of noise. The kind of poetry that I'd grown up learning was under complete attack. You know, the lyric was being questioned. And also I met this brilliant woman from Arkansas, C.D. Wright. Um, and and I met her because there's a poetry center at San Francisco State University, which is really significant. And I was going there and just reading alphabetically the books in there every day. And when I got to the W's and read a book by C.D. Wright, I realized she was on the other side of the stack. And I spoke to her, and that led to 35 years of living with this intense, brilliant poet.
Interesting. Yeah, and my condolences. I know that you wrote a collection called Be With,
Yeah.
about losing her, and I'm very sorry. But I also want to ask you, if I may, about the collaborative nature, like to be in a relationship with somebody who works in a similar vein, but who also is such an inspiration. I have to imagine that has an enormous impact on your work, and there's like a creative symbiosis that writers who are not in that situation lack. Can you talk a bit more about that? Because I'm married to a woman who is not a writer. She doesn't work in a literary vein. I have friends who are in writerly couples. I'm always curious, like what, like how it works. Like I know some people who like their spouse is their editor. If both people are writing poetry or both people are writing fiction, is there like a healthy competition that happens? Is there an equality or a balance that happens in terms of like how much one edits the other? Or do you see what I'm saying? Like, I'm just curious to know how it functioned.
I've seen a number of other couples for whom it functions really differently, especially if one becomes regarded as gets more attention than the other. It can be a difficult thing in a relationship. But in our relationship, one, she was a bit older than me, so she already had a reputation while I was just trying to forge one. So it didn't feel competitive in the beginning because we were at different levels. And in some sense, she was always at a different level. I would say from almost every other poet in the country, she, as one of her obituaries said, she was a school of exactly one. She was a real original. But we were each other's great readers for all that time. We would always show and trust because of that same thing, Brad, that you were talking about with that professor that told me these poems are terrible. She didn't have any problem telling me my poems were terrible either. And vice versa. And that's what you want, is someone who not only does that, but who can be a little more articulate about how you might make them less terrible.
Right. That's always nice too. It's nice when they give you it's terrible and here's how you can fix it.
Yeah. So we got good at that over 35 years. Yeah.
Wow. And is it, I have to imagine it's a different experience writing without that, or did she, I guess she probably left you with enough creative muscles and experience to manage it. Like just the difference in not having that sounding board has got to be significant.
It is significant, though it's also sort of instantiated in my brain. It's not like I live without her ever. And I'm in a relationship now with an artist, with a sculptural artist named Ashwini Bhatt, whose way of seeing has been quite helpful to me, interesting to me, because it comes from a different direction, and I found it very useful. Her critique. It's hard, right, Brad? With your own work, who do you show it to?
My agent, I have some writer friends, that I'll share it with who will be early readers and sounding boards. My wife, like just a small collection of people.
Yeah.
But
do you feel guilty when you ask your friends to read?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
I even have friends who be like, "I'll read it if you want." I'm like, no, don't, please. Don't. I won't do that to you. And I think too, I always bang the table for editors and people who have editorial skill. Obviously, as a writer, you have to have the ability to edit yourself. I think part of being a skilled and capable writer has something to do with that, has a lot to do with that. But people who can edit other people skillfully, that talent doesn't get the applause that it deserves. It's sort of a in the shadows role that's so vital, and I'm amazed by people who can do that really well, who can go into a text written by somebody else, understand it from that person's perspective with a lot of depth and accuracy. That is something that I can do to a degree, but not with professional skill. So I have limited faith in my ability as the editor of others. And I think that when I'm asked to evaluate somebody's work, I take that into consideration. I worry a bit. You know what I'm saying? I don't want to do a bad job.
Yeah.
And I feel like I wish I were better at it, to be honest. But I think it's like, it's one of those things, it's like, how sometimes people say, well, I'm going to write a book one day, those kinds of like cocktail party conversations you have.
Yeah, we've all heard that.
Yeah. And you're like, okay, well, good luck to you. But I think the same thing could maybe be said about editing. I think maybe because it's a little bit nebulous, how to be good at it or something, that everybody thinks they could do it, or that their opinion would be worth having. I'm not so sure, I think there's certainly different levels, and some people are very gifted at that. And I think that's where you want to land when you're handing your work off or having it handed to you. You want to really make sure you're honoring the process.
Yeah. And it's hard to find those particular people. It's not just everybody. Yeah.
And also the emotional, like the strength of relationship and the emotional ability to be willing to say, like, this isn't right. And here's why. It can be hard to disappoint people, I would imagine. You don't want to, I think that's part of my problem. I don't want to have to be like, I didn't like this, but you have to be able to have those conversations skillfully.
Mm-hmm.
And I think maybe the irony is that the writer hates to hear it at the beginning, but comes to be enormously grateful for it later.
Yeah. And you hope they don't hold that grudge, for that, however many years that is.
Yeah. Right. But I don't know. I mean, just speaking from my own experience, there's nothing I'm like, please save me from myself. Like I'm like eternally grateful to anybody who can save me from bungling something on the page, because of some blind spot. It's all I want is basically somebody to do that. So,
and that's the difference between, I think, the kind of artist I'm interested in being with, which is the artist whose goal is, no matter what, you want the work to be the best it can be, and then the artist who, well, I hear what you're saying, but I want it to be like that. I want it not to work like that. Where the people who just want praise.
Right. Right. I want to talk a little bit more about this. It's kind of a thematic concern. It's certainly a thematic concern of Twice Alive, but you alluded to it briefly when we were talking about CD, is this notion of like how, the criticism and those conversations around aesthetics and editorial concerns are kind of ingrained after all those years together. I was writing a letter to a late friend of mine's parents. My friend passed away a decade ago, guy I grew up with, and I write to his parents, especially around the anniversary of his passing. And I was writing a letter kind of trying to say something not profound, but meaningful. And I found myself writing like, still miss him, but never feel like he's very far. And it's a simple, kind of common thing to say, but it struck me at a level of profundity when I put it down, because I hadn't really given a lot of conscious thought to this notion that he never really seems very far. But it really, really struck me as true. I was like, wow, I don't think I feel some great distance from him. I don't think that I go through I certainly miss him in the day-to-day way that I once interacted with and knew him. But I guess it kind of surprised me. It surprised me to see it on the page like that. Do you get what I'm saying? Like, do you know?
Yeah. Ezra Pound has a beautiful line, how can it be far if I can think of it? That's as we get older and our lives are impacted more and more by mortality. The only way to survive it is to realize that we carry those people with us in not just some romantic or pictorial way, but in a very real way. And sometimes I think about the dreams that were told by the people that we're intimate with, dreams that your girlfriend told you when you were 23, and then those people disappearing from the world, and you have this memory, this thing in your mind that never existed anywhere in the world except in one person's brain, like the most intimate thing possible that you're carrying, that's part of you now. Those things, they fill me with a kind of luminous joy.
Yeah. And I think too about, I've been thinking a lot about consciousness. I don't want to get too far. I'm going to screw up the conversation because I don't have language for it necessarily or enough knowledge to speak of it, but I don't think anybody necessarily does. Insofar as I understand, I don't think the scientific community has really figured out what exactly consciousness is. Mm-hmm. But there is kind of as you were talking about that memory, I was thinking about this kind of binding quality that consciousness seems to have for me, not just person to person, but person to plant and animal. Like, I think it feels kind of like, I always compare it to like gravity, for lack of a better thing, because it's this invisible force in the universe that impacts everything. And I feel like when it comes to loss and when it comes to this feeling of ever-presence or connectivity across space and time, that consciousness, memory, the stuff of that kind of immaterial seeming experience, there's a lot of magic and mystery in it. And I think that's a place where I go mentally when I'm trying to make sense of these feelings.
Yeah. So that's the place where art happens, right? It's that unknown. There's this beautiful thing that St. John of the Cross, who's a poet and a martyr, writes. He writes, "Entreme donde no supe, y quédame no sabiendo, toda ciencia trascendiendo." So I entered into unknowing, and I remained there without knowing, rising above all science or all, scientific thought. And the thought that that's where you're going, that you need to get to a place of unknowing, where it's not determined, where there's not a handy explanation for what's going on, and that you feel something there that enlarges your soul. That's, I think, what calls a lot of people towards art, either as viewers or readers or writers or makers. Do you think?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And it's also making me think, you say it's from St. John of the Cross. It's also sounding very Buddhist to me. That's like my primary orientation. And I'm always heartened when I feel these synergies, because I think it's true that there are, all these different traditions are basically headed in the same direction at their best, different paths up the mountaintop. But it sounds like a description of the extinction of all notions of nirvana, and getting to a place that's sort of beyond language and beyond takes and attachments, mentally or otherwise. And I guess I'm curious to know, on a related note, if in your personal life or your day-to-day, if there's like a spiritual tradition or practice that informs your work or has sustained you through the years.
Yeah, I think the spiritual practice of attentiveness, which is very much a Buddhist, concept, but I'm very disappointed with the institutional religions of the world, almost every single one of which has misogyny at its root, and even the Buddhists, look at what's happening with the Rohingya now, have a history of, terrible violence of using power over others. So my spiritual interests are more personal, and also because I've been around people who can make beautiful, grand statements that are very impressive, and that maybe I've tried to be someone like that too, who can feel righteous about my statements. But when you get down to the lick log, it's, are you tender with those people that you're most intimate with the creatures around you that you're most, it's at a, I think I say this in Be With, that the political begins in intimacy. And I think it's in our most intimate relations that we construct the mode of being in the world that most counts.
Yeah, that's a beautiful thought. I think that, I think talking of politics and as writers, I think we're all instinctively or in practice, or hopefully both, cutting against mainstream cultural concerns. It sort of takes that.
Yeah.
And I think that it's easy to become overwhelmed when you try to consider what to do about political injustice, any number of problems in the world, like how to be, what to do on the day-to-day. And there's something comforting and practical and deeply practical about narrowing it down to your own little domestic sphere, the sphere of who you're intimate with, the sphere of, wife, significant other, partner, children, neighbors, the animals in your backyard, your dog or your cat, whatever it is, start there and practice well and start small. And, maybe, hopefully things will either build outward from that direction or will in some way take care of themselves, because if you're not doing those things, how much good are you going to be out on the stump?
I think that's really profound, Brad. I think what you said is what I believe. You can be my yogi.
No, but I also relate very much to the personal pursuit of it because, I think at least some part of my creative self is a reaction against the Catholicism of my youth. which I didn't jibe with. You know, like I've talked a bit about this on the show, but you know, through the years. But I don't think I had great teachers. I think if I'd had like some really cool scholarly Jesuit to sort of help me sift through.
Or Thomas Merton.
Yeah, Thomas Merton. I would have been like, okay, well, then I can deal with this. But I had people who were like, you will burn. It's not exactly enticing. But I think as a result of that, and maybe just the way that I'm wired, I just have such a resistance and suspicion or skepticism of institutional religion, even in Buddhism, you know, which is the one that I think fits me the best psychologically. Like even there, I've sort of kind of taken a cafeteria, you know, approach where I kind of pick and choose the things that work for me. And I think at its best that Buddhism's like, that's fine. You know, the best teachers are sort of advocating for that. They certainly don't want you to toe the line. And but I think there's a part of me that's like entirely comfortable working that way. It's kind of who I am. There's another part of me that at times can feel a wish that I had a greater sense of community with others. You know what I'm saying? I'm kind of like that lone wolf with my nose in a book, or I'm listening to a podcast trying to kind of put it together myself. And I'm like, you know, I wish that there was just like a really wise teacher and like 3 or 4 other people that I liked who I could sort of sit down with. We could kind of go over this together. I'd probably get there faster if I had that, but you know, I haven't been able to find it yet.
Well, that's curious. I mean, you talked about having these readers that you trust to read your work, and then this whole enterprise of your podcast is, you know, this very large making of community. What Robert Creeley used to call a company. You know, you put a company together. That would seem to be sustaining to some degree. No?
Oh, it is. It is. Yeah, I think like I'm speaking more like narrowly of spiritual concerns. You know, like I was thinking of like sitting under a large tree or something, having somebody teach me the way. Like that sort of. You know, you want that. It's like kind of a common desire to have somebody who's like really, really wise, kind of accelerate your progress. You know, and even more than that, and maybe like at a lower human level, this notion of wanting somebody like that to see something in you. You know, like
I get that.
You've got potential, kid. You've got a big soul. You know, or whatever it is. And I think that you can spend a long time maybe waiting for that to happen, but. I appreciate you saying that about community with respect to this show, because I certainly feel that. And I think sometimes because it's a virtual, especially in the age of the pandemic community, sometimes that aspect of it can get short shrift or could be overlooked. But I think for me, both as a person who's moderating a show like this, but also as a person who listens to a lot of audio, a lot of podcasts, that's some of the best stuff about the whole thing is the sense of community that you feel and connectivity that you feel, even though you might be at a physical remove. You know, that's certainly like one of the higher aspirations that I have for this show from the jump was that, you know, you have all these different writers and readerly and literary people out there working in their little hovels, and to provide a sense of connectivity and conversation that could sort of bridge some of those divides, you know, and make people feel less alone in their labor.
Yeah, you put down the mycelium.
Yeah, right.
Nexus. Yeah.
That's right. And as you say that, I mean, we talked about Stamets and Anne Pringle earlier, and mycology, and the mystery and majesty and kind of overlooked mystery and majesty of the mushroom kingdom. But tell me about that again, because I remember. Like there's a communicative property to mushrooms. I believe it's subsurface that is extraordinary. Am I misremembering this? Like they really talk to one another. And you also mentioned the predictive quality of lichens with respect to pollution. You know, I think the word litmus is derived, or lichen is derived from the word for litmus, or you know, whatever it is. There's an etymological connection there, but. there's an intelligence to mushrooms that I don't think people realize. Can you speak to that a bit?
Just that's been this brilliant revelatory scientific consensus in the last 20 years is that there's no such thing as a single tree. That right, we see a mushroom, but a mushroom is just the fruiting body of a large organism that is underground that we don't see. The real fungus is underground. This little thing that pops up into our view is a tiny part of it. You can kick it and you won't kick it off, and you don't injure the fungus at all. So that sense of the buried life, the invisible life, the connected life, is the sense that has to drive us towards being a less egocentric and egocentric species that thinks of ourselves as this singularity. We are nature. We are an animal. We are composed of all kinds of other animals, even at the level of our DNA. So we're a multiple. And until we begin to invest in ourselves and our world with that in mind, it's very easy to be as short-sighted as we've been, and to be in the predicament that we've brought us to, where species are just winking out like crazy, and the coral in the sea is drying up, and the tundra is wakening, and just dramatic world changes.
What about despair? I feel like it's a natural way to feel when you consider all this. Like, as you were like enumerating those things, like the tundra, the species winking out, the coral drying up. I mean, we've all seen these stories, or most of us have anyway, with respect to the climate crisis. And I've done a bit of reading in this space, like books about what we're up against. And man, those are some harrowing reads. I think when you're actually faced with what the future in even just the next 50 to 100 years could look like, it can leave you overwhelmed and despairing. I'm sure you felt those feelings. I'm wondering how you deal with them, and like where you find hope.
Yeah, I got to meet James Baldwin once in Providence at a First Baptist church there, and I remember him saying that you cannot let your bitterness overtake your creativity. You can't let your bitterness destroy you. And there's a beautiful poem by Jack Gilbert also called A Brief for the Defense, where he talks about, of course, there's misery everywhere. There's, flies in the eyes of babies and people starving to death. And yet even the poor will laugh. Even, in the poorest places I've been in Western China, people have art in their house. They've painted their walls. They don't live without moments of joy. And that if we let our despair overwhelm us, then we become helpless to fight against it. So I do look for hopeful ways of imagining a future. Some scientists are saying it's too late. We're not going to be able to recover it. Gary Snyder said to me that the world's going to be fine without us. He's not going to get that worried about what's going to happen, because it'll keep going. The human isn't, the necessary part of the equation. But I think the human can be a part of the equation if we act more responsibly on the world, act more as though we have an intimate relationship with all otherness, not just the otherness in the house, under our roof.
Yeah, that Gary Snyder anecdote you just told made me think of two things. First of all, it made me think of George Carlin, the late great George Carlin, and he has this great bit about people saying they're going to save the planet, and he's like, the planet is going to be fine. He's like, we're fucked. He's like, pack your bags, folks. Like we're not going to save the planet. The planet's just fine without us. It's been around for millions and millions of years, but that resonates. And then there's also another Gary Snyder anecdote that your story brought to mind, and I'm going to be paraphrasing, but basically Snyder was talking about environmental activism and the seat of motivation for it. Like if you're out there and you're deeply concerned, as I think so many of us are, about the state of things ecologically and the future that we're going to leave for our kids and grandkids and all the rest, he was saying something along the lines of like, don't do it out of guilt or self-hatred. Do it because you love it.
That's the thing, to bring love into the equation, not just despair, not just fear, but to do it because we love each other and we love being here.
Yeah, and the planet. And, it also makes me think of all these, like the expeditions to Mars. I've gone back and forth through the years, with my, like there's part of me, like the comedic side of me is like, Mars looks like a hellscape. It's freezing. Who wants to go there? Like I'll stay here. Thanks. Like I'm perfectly happy to stay here and, on this sweltering blue marble or whatever. But, I think that's a little bit limiting. I think that there's something great and noble about the spirit of exploration. And I think it's awesome to imagine our species like venturing out into the cosmos. Like it's a very natural progression. It's maybe the most natural thing you could imagine is that like, where are we? We're in this vast universe. Like, of course we're going to explore it. Of course we should have that impulse and want to do that. But, unless and until we can find a planet more habitable, I'm going
Which
to.
Mars isn't going to be. Yeah.
No, I'm going to wish to stay here and hope that we can reckon with our failings, and the damage that we've done and try to correct it, and maybe hold out hope that there's going to be some innovation of some kind that can help to help fix things. Like maybe that's a technological hope that, is piled on top of a bunch of problems that were created by too much technology or something. But, hopefully there's going to be a brighter day.
I think it'll be a combination of things, and I don't think it'll be one fix. I think we can do small things. Biden's proposals for energy policies are really encouraging.
Yeah. I've been hopeful thinking about that. I hope that we can get them over the line, all of them, and see them put into practice because we don't have much time. It's got to happen.
Yeah.
Last thing I want to ask you, since it's especially germane because I think today they're announcing the Pulitzers. Yeah. So you are a Pulitzer Prize winner, and I'm always interested to hear people's experiences. I've talked to some people who have won major literary awards in the past. I often ask them, like, what was it like to get that award? Like, how did it actually happen? Where were you? What was your response? Was it a surprise? All those things.
It was a total shock. It's still sort of a shock. I feel like one of my heroes is a poet named George Oppen, who lived in San Francisco for a long time, and he seems like a really unlikely character to win a Pulitzer Prize, but he did for a book I really love called Of Being Numerous. And I feel like an outsider like him. I think partly it might be, I think of it as a reward for not just one book, but maybe, how these things happen. It's supposed to be for one book, but I think it was also kind of for 50 years of writing or something, for a lot of books. And it's really, it's really validating. It really, it's not Yeah, it felt really good, Brad. It felt really good to have my peers choose it. I'd had another book, Core Samples from the World, that had been a Pulitzer finalist. Um, but those, when you're announced, if you're giving a reading or something, and X he was a finalist for this and a finalist for that, and but with the Pulitzer, I finally won it.
Yeah, right. It's like now you are forever a Pulitzer Prize winning poet. That's great, and I feel like it would have to have at least some impact on, I don't know, like your work as a poet. You're getting invited to teach or getting invited to read. That sort of stuff has to pick up as a result. No, are there material changes that you've noticed in the aftermath?
Yeah, and that was good because in the wake of CD's death, I again sort of fled my life. I sold my house at a loss. I moved to California. I quit my job, a terrific job at Brown University, and so with the Pulitzer, it's enabled me to continue to earn a living while I'm not teaching full time, and that's been practically very, very useful. I think also at sort of the level of writing, it gave me a little more confidence about the trajectory that I wanted to take my work in, and so I think the new book, Twice Alive, is a better book. It won't win the Pulitzer, but I think it's probably the best book that I've written, and it's partly because of the sense that I had of what worked for a larger audience with Be With, that allowed me to move in this trajectory with this book, Brad.
Well, I certainly enjoyed it, and I've loved talking with you. I'm wondering, I guess that this one's making its way out into the world. I don't mean to get ahead of ourselves here, but are you working on anything new? Like, are you always kind of putting words on the page and working towards a new collection, or is there anything like material in the offing?
I have. I've been working on translations since I finished that book, and I've translated a book by a fantastic Mexican poet named Corral Bracho, and that'll come out next year from New Directions. And then I co-translate from Japanese because my Japanese isn't good enough to do. And I've done a couple books, and I finished a new translation by a poet named Shuri Kido, and that book will come out from Copper Canyon.
Awesome.
So I haven't been writing new poems except for this collaboration with a photographer named Jack Shear, which has been really fun. And right when I felt kind of stuck about what I wanted to do, that came along as a project where I'm writing poems for his photographs that felt great.
Well, I congratulate you on all of the above, and I appreciate the time and that you've taken here to talk with me and my listeners.
Thank you, Brad. You're like the easiest person in the world to talk with, and it's not just with me. You have that in you with all the people you talk with. You have a tremendous facility.
Oh, well, I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Brad.
All right, there you have it. That is Forrest Gander. His new collection is called Twice Alive, available now from New Directions. You can find him online. His website is forrestgander.com. Once again, the new collection is called Twice Alive, available now from New Directions. Go get your copy online or in person at the bookstore. Twice Alive. The Otherppl podcast is offered freely. The entire archive of this show, more than 700 episodes and counting, all of it is made available to you, the listener, for free. It's a listener-supported show. If you listen regularly, if you like the program, if you get something from it, and if you have the means, support the show. tip your server. You can do that over at patreon.com/otherpplpod. Patreon.com/otherpplpod for as little as $1 a month, people. You can support the show. There are different levels and tiers of support. At higher levels, you can get stuff. T-shirt, tote bag, coffee mug, sticker. I will write you a postcard and deliver it to your house. Not personally, you know what I mean. I'll send you a postcard. I'll wish you a happy birthday. Patreon.com/otherpplpod. If you have something to say to me, if you want to offer some feedback, the email address for this program is letters@otherppl.com. Letters@otherppl.com. The Other People podcast has its own official app. It too is free. Go get the app. The Other People with Brad Listi app, available now wherever you get apps. It's a good app. The Other People podcast is available on YouTube as well. Did you know that? This is a relatively new development. The Other People podcast YouTube channel. The entire archive is up there on YouTube. Go get it. Subscribe. It also helps this program if you offer up a review on Apple Podcasts. Review the show wherever you can. It helps it find new listeners algorithmically. All right, I don't know what's coming up next. Who's coming up next? I think it's Greg Gerke.